Do you feel like you suck at prayer? If I'm being honest, I know I live there sometimes. I feel like I'm not connecting with God. And prayer is a mechanism for connecting with the God of the universe. And what we know when it comes to connecting with the God of the universe, that our motives matter. So part of getting to a place where you feel like you don't suck at praying, I think we have to consider our motives. Because just to say it again, connecting with the God of the universe, or when we're connecting with Him, motives matter. And Jesus is really good at getting to the heart of people's motives. We're going to look at the Lord's Prayer today and look at Jesus' model prayer for the disciples. And in that, we can extract some principles and things, practical things from life, but it's almost equally as important for us to understand the world that Jesus was speaking into, what these men would have seen. And Jesus in chapter 6, verses 5 through 8, he talks about two specific hypocritical types of people or things that they do that are different than how God would have them done. And the first one, he says, don't be like these hypocrites that are praying on the street corners. Like those are the people that are wanting their reward now. Right? He gets to the heart of that motive and he says, listen, don't look for your reward through prayer or your reward from God. Don't try to get that now. He says, but instead go to a closed room to where nobody knows you are. And he says, there you pray and there God will hear you and then God will give you a reward, but it's all going to be unseen. It's an interesting juxtaposition for him to present there. He's like, don't do the things publicly, do them in private. And I don't think he means that we can't pray out loud or in public. I think it's a motivation he's getting after when he's talking to his disciples. In the second one, in verses 7 and 8, he says, don't be like the babbling pagans, right? They use all these words and they're trying to make their God love them and all that type of stuff. And what they would have all seen would have been these other pagan temples, these non-Jewish temples around their cities, every city that they'd ever lived in or the city that they grew up in, however that worked. And they would have heard that these people prayed. And what these priests did was they would say the same prayers over and over and over and over. I even read one place where sometimes it'd be hours at a time of these priests using the exact same sentence, trying to get this God that they're worshiping to do what they want them to do, or trying to get in good standing with this God or whatever. He paints this picture of trying to earn credibility with God through prayer and babbling the same things over and over and over. He says, don't do that because the God of the universe already knows your need. He's already relationally deeply connected to you. So for us in prayer, we need to acknowledge the connection, acknowledge our place, and then we can use Jesus' model prayer as we learn it to kind of navigate our own prayer life. So in Jesus' model prayer that he gives to us in Matthew 6, it's actually a really beautiful thing that he walks us through. He walks his disciples through. We don't necessarily know kind of what's going on per se. I know in the book of Luke, it's a little bit of a different feel. I know they approached him and it's not like that here, but I still think the idea behind it is the same. And there's four concepts or four things that I want to bring out of this passage known as the Lord's Prayer. And the first one is belief. The second one is trust. The third one is forgiveness. And the last one is faith. And first and foremost, here's what I know. I know that those are four pretty common words in the world of the church and in the world of Christianity, but I do believe they're very intentional. Jesus says this, if you're going to pray this way. He says, Our Father. Mark Weaver talked about this last week. We'll put a link to that in the description. But he talked about the phrase, Our Father, last week. And he said, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Now, the cool thing about this is that that's derived from this old Jewish prayer. And I love it that Jesus is constantly going back into his culture and his tradition to go and understand and illustrate the nature and character of our God. But essentially that word hallowed was this concept of saying, hey, God is going to show himself holy. Like at some point in the end of all things, God's going to be proven that he's holy. Like it's going to be displayed. It's a really cool thing that I think we can draw off of whenever we're approaching God, because there's two sides of it. Number one is simply this. We got to ask ourselves the question is, do we really believe that God's holy? We could say yes, like that's a simple super Christian answer. Yeah, we could say, of course we believe God's holy. But we got to think about it. Like in the midst of suffering, do you really believe that God's holy? I know in 2020, my mom went into hospital for a routine procedure and we buried her a week later. That was a momentous time of suffering for me and my family. And though I can sit here on the post side and say, yeah, well, I assume God was holy, like there were some real conversations between me and God saying, like, what's going on? Like, it's not like my mom was debilitating and already suffering and dying. She was in for a routine procedure and she passed away. So you have to answer the question, is God holy? Jesus spends his entire life talking about the kingdom of God on earth. As we talked about earlier, it's all kinds of opposite of reality that we seem to be experiencing. But do we believe that God in his kingdom is holy? Answer that one first. And then secondly, we have to answer the question, okay, so if God is holy, then how do we hallowed God's name in modern day, 2022? How do we live our lives in such a way to prove that God is holy? We did a series recently called Stop Going to Church that kind of dealt with this concept. It says it in 2 Corinthians chapter 5 that it's as if God is using you, if you call yourself a follower of Jesus, to make his appeal to the world about his son Jesus. Is God holy? Would his kingdom be holy? How do we live that out on earth as it is in heaven? How can people watch your life and watch my life and say, okay, like this God must be a good, beautiful God because this person claims to be a follower of Jesus, claims to be a worshiper of God, if you will, and does their life line up with that claim? I believe Jesus' life is riddled with challenging people on those deals. So belief is the first ideal. Two questions riddled with that. One, is God holy? Two, how do we live that out in our modern day 2022? And I'm not going to answer that question for you. I think there's some principles there, but I think that's a question that you need to answer on your own that comes with maybe some different things than what comes in my life. So second, trust. So if you go back all the way back to the beginning of the Bible, in the second book of the Bible, there's a book called Exodus. A really cool story, but God essentially takes his people out of slavery and comes in and says, listen, you're not going to put my people and keep my people in slavery anymore. Like I'm going to get rid of that. We're going to get you free. So he sends this guy named Moses, and Moses goes in there, and after a series of events, God's people end up fleeing the country. Here's the challenge. They end up going into a desert. Interesting juxtaposition because you have Egypt, which is wrought with water and it's wrought with food and all the provision that they needed. And God said, no. We're going to deliver you from this and I want you to go into a desert. And then it goes to say that he gave them enough bread, daily bread, if you will, give us this day our daily bread, gave them enough bread and water for them to survive. Enough bread and water to get them through the day. So the second thing that we have to kind of navigate when it comes to our own motivations in prayer, according to Jesus' model, is do we trust that God will provide? If you're anything like me, when things are hard or things tend to get financially difficult with me and my family, it's really hard. I need to work. I'm going to go work more and I'm going to do these things. I got to go do all this stuff to make sure that I can take care of my family. And I know that there's good in that, but on the other side of it, if I'm being perfectly honest, a lot of that is because I don't know that I'm trusting the Lord with the journey. And I don't know that I'm trusting the Lord when I'm in the middle of the desert. And, is he really going to provide the things that I need in order for me and my family to survive, even thrive in the midst of having enough daily bread? And we're not sure about tomorrow. Interesting concept that Jesus brings in here. Give us this day our daily bread. Do you trust that God's going to provide that for you? Interesting that Jesus brings that up in his model prayer. Third is forgiveness. Maybe the most difficult one, probably the most complex one in my opinion. See, God created this whole system, right? What we call the law. He created this whole Old Testament system, and you can go back and read the book of Leviticus if you want to. A pretty interesting read, but there's like 613 laws that God's put in there. And it's everything from cleanliness laws to economic laws to sacrifices and things like that. One of those rhythms that God set in place as it pertains to forgiveness was that every 7th year and every 50th year, people's debts were completely forgiven, completely wiped out. So if I had $100,000 in debt and I get to the 50th year, my $100,000 of debt just disappears. Everything resets back to how it was. And God built this rhythm in there. And there's a couple reasons for that. I know one commentator said that God has a heart for his people. God has a heart for people in his creation. So he built in the system into their way of life that helped eliminate generational poverty. Every 7 years, you would have another shot to get back into things to do well for you and your family. And then if you didn't get every 7 years, then on the 50th year, you'd have it. And I think that's a really cool example of how God values his people. Jesus in this prayer is talking about forgive us of our debts as we forgive those, or forgive us of our trespasses or our sins as we forgive those who have sinned against us. And we're thinking through those things. It's kind of a cool thing about the nature and character of God to be displayed. If I just got all of my debt forgiven, it's going to help me to be able to forgive somebody else's that may be in debt to me. It's a cool way that God set it up because of this. And there's this old Jewish historian that I couldn't find his name anywhere, but he was accredited with it. And he says that only forgiven people truly understand the value of forgiveness. So when you're talking to God or approaching God in prayer, maybe your motivation is for you to pray and God say, God, like these people deserve justice for what they've done to me. This situation deserves this justice to come in. But what Jesus is saying is that we're going to ask God for forgiveness for our own sins and our own trespasses and our own failures so that we can be inspired and encouraged to take that same forgiveness because we understand the value of it and offer it to somebody else that may have sinned against us. And I don't think that necessarily means that you forget anything. I don't think you ever forget the things that people do to you. However, if you've ever been forgiven of anything, I firmly believe you understand the value in your life of forgiveness. And when you're walking truly forgiven, how that just tends to change everything. So he says, forgive us of our sins as we forgive those who have sinned against us. And the last thing I want to talk about is really faith. And the last slide, I want to read it. This is Matthew chapter 6, starting in verse 13. It says, and lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from the evil one. Now, if you're like me, here's how I've always read that. It's like, you know what, God, keep me away from all this temptation. Like maybe it's almost like you're charting a course in an airplane if you're a pilot and you're avoiding storms. You can see them all coming. God, guide my way so that I don't have to get into a place to where I'm tempted to sin, because then, that's going to be a good. Then I can really live for you if I'm not tempted to do anything else. But upon further study of that passage, here's what we know that intends to be said by that passage. It's not God, keep me away from being tempted. It's God, help me to be able to resist the temptation. That's an important key difference, because there's an underlying assumption in the first one where we kind of expect God to deliver us from being tempted at all, that would say, okay, God, we're going to believe and follow in you, but it's not really going to be all that hard. I don't really want it to be hard. I want to be able to be in a place where I'm never tempted at all. Like that seems very simple. There's an assumption of no temptation on one side, but on the accurate interpretation, there's an assumption that every follower of Jesus will 100% be tempted at some point in your journey. And so the prayer is more of a prayer of dependence. God, lead me not into temptation. Help me whenever I face temptations and these trials and these struggles. Help me, give me the ability and the faith to walk away from the temptations and walk towards you. My friends, it's not about us not being tempted. It's not about you walking through life with no temptations in any way. It's all about us being able to have the faith that God himself is better than any temptation that we face. That's what it's all about. So it's belief. Is God holy? And if he is, how do we live that out here as followers of Jesus? Trust. Do we trust him for our daily provision? Do we trust that he has what's best in mind for us? Is he going to be there? Forgiveness. Are you walking in unforgiveness? Are you not forgiving yourself? Are there people in your life that you're not able to forgive? How do we walk that out? How do you absorb the forgiveness from God? Or how do you experience the forgiveness of God and let that catapult you into a place to be able to forgive other people because you understand the value of forgiveness? And lastly, may we be a people of faith, that we anticipate and we assume that we're going to walk in various temptations, in various trials, and various challenges in life. May we be a people of faith that can walk towards God in the midst of all those things. And by the way, I don't think praying this prayer means that you'll never fail at any of these things. I don't think it means that you're never going to struggle with belief. You're never going to struggle to trust God. You're never going to struggle to forgive people. And you're never going to struggle to have faith. It's a dynamic, ever-evolving journey that we're walking with this dynamic, beautiful God that is constantly helping us be reminded of his beauty and his goodness and his desire for a relationship with you. And at the end of the day, when we're praying, we're trying to connect to the God of the universe. And our motives and our approach to him matter more than we could ever imagine. I believe that. You saw that when Jesus preaches the Sermon on the Mount, the greatest thing that's ever been preached, the greatest sermon. And it's all about motives. It's all about our approach to God himself.